Hello, everybody. Welcome to Radiator Comics Studio. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our conversation with Jenny Robb from the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum about preserving your legacy. Radiator Comics Studio is a series of online programs and print publications, all designed to support and grow the cartooning community in South Florida and connect it with the national comics scene. Radiator Comics Studio is made possible with support from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, and we're grateful for their support, as well as the support of Oolite Arts and the Miami Foundation. My name is Neil Brideau. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I run Radiator Comics, which, when we're not doing events like this, we're distributing self-published and small press comics. We are broadcasting tonight from Miccosukee to Cuesta and Seminole Land. It's important to acknowledge that the land on which we live and work is stolen land, and the people from whom the land was stolen are still here and are still caring for the land. It's also important to acknowledge the stolen labor of African-American, Bahamian, Haitian, and other Caribbean people that was used to build South Florida into what we know it to be today. This history is still very present today and important to address. We all have a lifelong responsibility to be better caretakers of the land on which we live, to dismantle white supremacy, and be better community members and neighbors to the people around us. And we think that expressing one's ideas and feelings through comics and zines can be a really powerful way of doing some of that. And one of our hopes with programming like tonight's is to make all aspects of those tools of expression more accessible. So we're really grateful to have you all here tonight, and especially grateful to Jenny Robb for spending time with us to present her talk on preserving your legacy. After the presentation, we'll have the opportunity to ask Jenny questions about saving our art and papers and about the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum. For cartoonists, fans, and scholars, the Billy Ireland, which is located in Columbus, Ohio, is a truly magical place. And if you have the chance, you really should visit. Part of the Ohio State University Libraries, it houses the world's largest collection of materials related to cartoons and comics, including original art, books, magazines, journals, comic books, archival materials, and newspaper comic strip pages and clippings. Jenny can explain the library and museum much better than I can. So let me introduce her and she can take over. Jenny Robb is curator and associate professor of the Ohio State University Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum, the largest academic research institution dedicated to cartoons and comics. Before coming to Ohio State in 2005, she served as curator of the Cartoon Art Museum in San Francisco for 5 years. She holds master's degrees in history and museum studies from Syracuse University. Jenny Robb has curated numerous cartoon and comics exhibitions, including Exploring Calvin and Hobbes, The Long March, Civil Rights in Cartoons and Comics, and Looking Backward, Looking Forward, U.S. Immigration in Cartoons and Comics. She is the author of Bill Blackbeard, the Collector Who Rescued the Comics, published in the Journal of American Culture, and co-author of Finding Archives, Making Archives, Observations on Conducting Multicultural Comics Research, published in the book Multicultural Comics, From Zap to Blue Beetle, among other comics-related articles and catalog essays. So welcome, Jenny, and without any further ado, I will hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Neil. Can everybody hear me? I think I'm unmuted. All right. I assume you'll let me know if you can't. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Okay. Can everybody see that? Yes. Thumbs up. Okay. So I'm going to talk today about preserving your legacy, and this is particularly aimed at creators, but I think it's something that could be of interest to lots of other people as well. I certainly think that all creators should be considering their legacy, no matter how old they are or where they are in their career. And I think there's also a misconception out there that no one would be interested in what I have to say or my story or my legacy unless I'm one of the really famous creators. And that's certainly not true. And I hope by the end of my talk that you'll be thinking about yourself as someone who has an important story to tell and is certainly worthy of having your work preserved for future generations. So let's see if I can get this to work. Okay. So Neil mentioned a little bit about the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum. He said that we are the world's largest collection of cartoons and comics, and that we're part of the Ohio State University library system. So I also want to mention that we're a cultural heritage institution. And we recently rethought our mission, and our new mission statement is, and I'm sorry I have to read it, but I don't have it memorized yet. We're here to inspire the study and appreciation of cartoon and comics art by collecting, preserving, and making materials accessible for research, teaching, exhibitions, and educational programming. So what you're looking at here is our new facility. I say new, we opened in 2017, so I guess it's over 7 years old now. But we did an extensive renovation, and we really have a beautiful space. If you haven't had a chance to visit, I hope that you can once this pandemic is over. So I should also mention that we don't have this whole building. We do share this building with some other units at Ohio State. So we're a library. We are also an art collection or museum collection, and we also are an archive. And you can see here just by the numbers, the extent of our collection. We are, as I said, quite large. And also this will tell you a little bit about how we preserve the legacy of cartoonists and creators. When we're talking about that, we're really talking about preserving all of their creative and intellectual output. So that includes comic books, graphic novels, mini comics, or zines that they create, as well as any books or biographies or reference books about them. We collect original art, including finished work, of course, but also roughs and sketches and other types of original art. When we talk about an archive, we basically collect the papers of cartoonists, professional organizations like the National Cartoonist Society, as well as people who are in the business of cartooning. And when we say papers, we mean things like personal and professional correspondence, scripts, interviews, presentations, proofs, clippings of published work, articles about the creator or about cartoons and comics, really anything that would be considered archival. We also include in that our San Francisco Academy of Comic Art collection, which many of you may be familiar with, but it includes more than 2.5 million newspaper comic strip clippings and pages. So this represents our physical holdings. We are starting to collect digital files and digital materials as well. And of course, we do expect to be doing a lot more of that in the future. So a question that I often get is, who is Billy Ireland? So I like to just say right up front who he was. He's not as well known as some other cartoonists, but he was the cartoonist for the Columbus Dispatch from 1898 until 1935, and he drew political cartoons as well as a Sunday feature called The Passing Show, and I have an example of that from 1916 on the screen. It's really a beautiful page. This is the title panel. All of his title panels were unique, and they were all really clever and interesting. This particular one I chose because, of course, of the pandemic. This is 1916, and it shows the Passing Show letters as germs, grip germs or flu germs. And there's Billy Ireland on the right shooting a medicine cannon into the germs. So I thought that would be appropriate for our current situation. So I want to talk today about the top 10 things that you can do to preserve your legacy, especially if you're a creator. And first, I'm going to talk about preserving physical materials like art and like papers, and then also digital materials. And then we'll look at some things that you can do really to help preserve your legacy into the future. So number one, this one probably seems pretty obvious. Use the highest quality materials you can when you're creating physical art or publications. My preservation colleagues have identified what they call the agents of deterioration. I thought that was a really funny title, and it reminds me of like a supervillain team, like the Legion of Supervillains, Masters of Evil. These are the agents of deterioration that you have to watch out for. And they come in two categories. The first is internal factors, or what we call inherent vice. So these are things, it's a tendency of an object to deteriorate or self-destruct because of its intrinsic or internal characteristics or defects. So things like weak construction, poor quality, unstable media. So you want to be sure right from the beginning when you're creating something that you're using the best quality materials that you can, acid-free, archival. If you start with that, then you've got a good foundation for your art. This is just an example of some things from our collection that were created on materials that were not very high quality, and show you what kinds of things can happen with them. Of course, you want to consider the inks that you're using. This is a picture of Bill Watterson's tools that he used to create Calvin and Hobbes. We featured these in an exhibition of his work. But you want to look for inks that will have high durability and longevity. And one of the main factor here is light fastness. There's a couple different scales, different rating systems that will rate the light fastness. India ink, very high light fastness rating. Things like markers or felt tip pens like Sharpies often have very low light fastness ratings, and they will fade even if they're not exposed to light. So this is just an example where you can see that the black marker has already faded completely to yellow. They do have markers and other things that have higher light fastness ratings, but it's something that you would want to pay attention to if you're creating artwork. And probably goes without saying, but if you have any artwork with this kind of marker or Sharpie, you probably want to avoid as much light exposure as possible. So I recommend avoiding any non-archival tape, metal paper clips, and rubber cement, so the big red X. These are all things that do not hold up very well and can damage your artwork. This is an example of what happens to rubber cement. Again, it's an inherent quality. It's not because it wasn't stored correctly, it's just because this is what happens over time to rubber cement, and it turns very brittle and dark. We have lots and lots of art in our collection where the paste-offs just pop off, and we have to constantly watch out for that and make sure to reattach those with the proper kind of adhesive. So this is number two, and this is coming from the librarian here. Please put the date on everything you make. Again, this seems obvious, but it's really, really important. We have a lot of things in our collection that we don't know how to date, and it can be very frustrating. A lot of comic strips, for example, the date is always put on. The date that it's intended for publication is part of the work. That's fantastic. If your work is not like that, I recommend just turning it over, writing the date in pencil. That can be really, really helpful for future librarians and curators and biographers and researchers. They will all thank you for dating everything that you create. And I would even expand that to include putting important bibliographic information on any mini comics that you make. So make sure that it's clear who created it, what the title is, the date it was created or published, as well as who owns the copyright. We have lots of mini comics in our collection that we really struggle to catalog them because it's not obvious what this information is. And if we can't catalog it with all the correct information, then it makes it harder for people to find it. So something that I want everybody to remember if you can. So number three, you want to store your physical art, papers, and publications in the best location that is available to you. So we were talking about the agents of deterioration, the first category being internal factors or inherent vice. The second category is external factors. And so here's a list of them from my my conservator colleagues. They include things like human behavior that causes damage, exposure to risks from physical forces like earthquakes or floods or fire, as well as just poor environmental conditions where things are stored. So this would be things like incorrect temperature or humidity or light. The ideal is to find a place that is cool, climate controlled, and dry, with a minimum fluctuations of temperature and humidity. So the rule of thumb is that if you're not comfortable living and working in the space year round, it's probably not the best place to store your treasures. Basements obviously are not a great choice. They're prone to flooding. They can be damp even if they don't flood. Attics, another place, especially if they're not climate controlled, aren't ideal. And garages, again. These are all places that run the risk of extreme temperatures, high humidity, rapid changes in temperature, pests, as well as mold. So if you can avoid these kinds of places, we recommend it. A closet in your house, under the bed, in your studio are all better options. You might not have a choice. It's possible that you just, you say, well, I really don't have a choice. I have to store it in one of these places. So I would say the most important thing is to try to keep, to not store your work in damp areas or areas that might have a lot of moisture. And the reason for that is mold. So mold spores, my conservative friends, once again, tell me are everywhere. They can be active, they can be dormant, but they're all around us all of the time. And what they're really basically doing is just waiting for the right damp conditions to colonize. So here are some examples of mold that has been allowed to run rampant. These are not from our collection, but I will say that we have had materials that have come in that have mold on them. It's very expensive to mitigate, and it's very dangerous for humans to be around mold. So it's just a huge problem all around. So the best thing you can do is make sure that you don't have a mold problem in the first place. So I do recommend, if you can, if you have a storage area where you've got your original art or your papers or other publications, that you can purchase a relatively inexpensive temperature and humidity monitor to really see what's going on. And if you're getting fluctuations, this one, for example, will tell you what the low temperature and humidity was, what the high temperature and humidity was over a certain period of time. So you can really tell what's going on where you're storing your materials. This is particularly important if you're storing them in an area that's not climate controlled. I also recommend if you do have to store it in a damp area that you try to use a dehumidifier. There are other ways that you can help mitigate the situation if you don't have an ideal storage situation. So in addition to where the location of where you're storing things, you also want to house your physical art, papers, and publications in the best possible way. There's lots of options. Metal flat files are great. Acid-free boxes are great. Those are excellent choices. Filing cabinets are good. You want to be careful with any kind of wooden furniture, especially if it's unpainted, because they can emit gases that will discolor paper and artwork. Also be very careful of just regular cardboard boxes that aren't acid-free. They can also damage paper. If you're using any kind of interleaving paper or folders, you want to, again, use acid-free materials. You can also use Mylar sleeves. We do recommend a two-sided Mylar sleeve so that you're not creating a microclimate if it's completely sealed. You don't want to create a microclimate. I'll talk a little bit about that. And also, you don't want to use Mylar if your media is friable, which is a media like charcoal. You wouldn't want to use Mylar for that. The particles of charcoal can stick to it. So I often get asked about storing in plastic bins. And I talked extensively to our conservators about this. They do not recommend it because, again, I mentioned before the situation with creating a microclimate, and that traps in heat, humidity, pollutants that may be off-gassing from whatever materials are in the bin, and it can kind of create a greenhouse effect and accelerate degradation of whatever's there. So they don't recommend storing things in plastic bins. I also get asked about Itoya, and I don't know if I'm saying that right. Portfolios, a lot of people store original art in these portfolios. They do advertise that they're 100% acid-free and archivally safe. But you do want to be careful that you're not, again, creating an airtight situation where, where there's a microclimate that can lead to damage to your objects. So this leads me to the fifth thing, which is, especially if you're storing things in non-ideal situations or housing, really just inspecting your work on a regular basis can make a huge difference. Our conservators even talk about just airing things out on a regular basis. So if it is in a bin, or it is in a drawer, or some other closed container, just opening those drawers, opening the bins, and letting the air circulate on a regular basis can really help. And also it gives you an opportunity to look and see if there's a problem. You can see if there's signs of deterioration, of mold, of pests. Sometimes you can't see mold, but you can smell a musty smell. So again, checking your storage areas regularly is a great idea, and you can sometimes catch problems before they get to be too bad. So I'll just add a couple more points about preserving particularly original art. One is, if you're going to display it, be careful about the materials you use. Obviously acid-free, you want to have some kind of a UV glass or plexi. But I will say that if you display something for decades, it will still suffer light damage. And you can see this example here where someone obviously had this Lynn Johnson original matted and displayed for a long period of time, and you can see the discoloration that happened. So even if you're using a UV plexi, you wouldn't want to display something where it can where there's sunlight or where there's UV light. And then another thing that we often see is materials that come in that have been water damaged. If you suffer this, maybe you have things in a basement or somewhere where there's a flood, the first thing you should do is obviously separate all the materials out, try to lie them flat in a well-ventilated area and let them dry. The goal here is to keep mold from growing. So mold is the #1 enemy, and you just want to be sure that you dry things as quickly as possible to keep mold from colonizing, from taking hold and colonizing. You can call in a conservator. There are vendors who will freeze dry and do other things. It really depends on the work and what you're willing to do. But even just by yourself, you can really dry things very quickly at home and mitigate a lot of the damage. Okay, so moving on. This is an Eldon Dedini cartoon. We have Eldon's collection at our library. We obviously are entering an era where a lot of our creative and intellectual output is digital. In the library world, this includes born digital materials such as artwork created directly on a Cintiq or tablet. It includes things like emails and other kinds of documents that are born digital, but also when people scan or digitize physical materials. So those are all the types of digital files that we might collect in a library. So I recommend, number 6, use best practices when digitizing your work or creating born digital work. So here are some of those best practices, and I'm apologizing right now for this boring text slide. But you want to use a consistent file naming convention, preferably that includes your name, title of the work, the date it was created or published. The Library of Congress has a handy webpage that talks about the recommended formats for still image works. So this, you can see what the latest thing is that libraries are requesting for long-term preservation. One thing to consider is if you've got files that are in proprietary formats, converting them to an open format. Open formats are more likely to be supported and accessible in the distant future. And of course, I'm sure everyone here is regularly backing up their devices and all of their files, making even more than one backup or archive, preferably keeping one at an offsite location or in the cloud in case something should physically happen to your storage. Also just mention really quickly some strategies to consider to preserve, again, your papers or your archives. We in the library world right now, in the archive world, we're really at the very beginning of understanding how we can collect and preserve and provide access to what amounts to thousands and thousands and thousands of born digital documents that we're starting to see creators collecting over their lifetime. So ways that you can start doing things right now that might help librarians in the future preserve your archives. You could tag emails that you want to include. So in other words, you know, we all have tons of emails that maybe we don't want to be part of our long-term legacy, or, you know, are just going back and forth trying to figure out what time to meet or where to meet someone that, you know, maybe aren't the most important thing. But you might have other emails that, you know, where you talk a lot about your creative process or a particular project that you're working on, or emails between your publisher and you. So if you know it's something that might be interesting and you might want to be part of your archives in the future, I recommend either tagging them or putting them in a clearly marked folder so that, that those can be harvested at some later date. You can also, if you choose, if you have really important things that you've written on the computer, print out a physical copy. So number 7, have your work represented in a library, preferably a special collection. So basically libraries and sometimes museums can help to preserve your legacy and make it possible for people to discover and access your work for many generations. So if we're considering publications, certainly more and more libraries are collecting comics, graphic novels, and even mini comics and zines. So you want to keep in mind here that most public libraries focus on circulating collections, and their collections are constantly changing. So because something is in a circulating collection now does not mean it will always be there in the future. The advantage of having your work represented in a special collection is that once things become part of a special collection, they're usually there to stay forever and ever. When I'm thinking about what to collect, I'm thinking about as much about researchers in 100 years as I'm thinking about researchers that are coming in today. Also, special collections, because things don't circulate physically, the items will be preserved in better condition for the future. And so that's another reason why you would want to have your work represented there. So if you're interested in perhaps donating your publications, look for libraries that have special collections of comics, graphic novels, mini comics. This is an example of not my institution, but another one, the University of Iowa libraries. You can see there some of the things that they're collecting. Comic books, zine collections. If you look there to the bottom, it says this collection, the collections listed above either contain comic books exclusively, or in the case of the zine collections, contain numbers of underground and or amateur produced comics and mini comics. So again, we're seeing a lot of interest in this material from special collections all over the country and all over the world. I do recommend contacting any collection that you're interested in having your work represented in, and talking with them about whether or not they're accepting material, whether they're accepting donations, making sure that it fits into their scope. All libraries have their own policies about what they can purchase and what they can even accept as donations. So you want to be sure to check with them before you just send something in. And I'll just give you an example of some things that we have recently acquired. This is a collection of self-published comics of Kurt Erickson, who created the gay-themed comic strip Murphy's Manor from 1981 to 2008. We also recently acquired the collection of Vernon E. Grant. He was a pioneer in the self-publishing movement. He created the Love Rangers comic book and self-published it from 1977 to 1988. He's also really interesting because he lived in Japan for a number of years in the 1960s and is credited with being the first American cartoonist to introduce Japanese manga approaches and concepts into his work. You know, he's not as well known as others, but I think his collection is really fascinating. Another recent acquisition, Carta Munir donated a large collection of original art. She is the creator of a number of works, including Secure Connect from 2016 that you can see a, sorry, blurry image there. Now that I'm looking at it, I see that's not a very high quality image. But also Carta is the creator, is the founder and publisher of Diskette Press, which is a small press publishing house focusing on publishing and distributing mini comics and zines by trans and queer comics makers. So if you are thinking of making more of a larger donation to a special collection that would include original art or papers and archives, it's definitely a great way to help preserve your legacy. But I will say that a lot of people have a misconception that they'll be able to take a tax deduction for donating their work. And unfortunately, Richard Nixon really ruined that for all creators and artists and authors everywhere. He attempted to take a large deduction on his taxes for when he donated his papers to the National Archive. This is a cartoon about that by Mike Peters from the Dayton Daily News. And Congress said, oh my goodness, you know, all these authors and artists and politicians, they're just ripping us off. They're taking these big deductions for donating their art and their papers. We've got to put a stop to that. So in 1969, I believe, they passed a law that basically said, if you're the creator of the work, you can't take the fair market value as a deduction. You can only take the cost of the materials. So obviously that decreases the incentive to donate your materials. You know, still preserving your legacy is a really good reason to do it, but unfortunately for artists, there's not really a tax benefit involved. So number 8, I recommend that everyone, no matter how old you are, have a will and be as specific as possible about what you want to happen to the things that you own, to your artwork, to your papers, to anything of value that you have. And this is just a funny cartoon. It's very hard to find cartoons about making wills, but this is from our collection. I recommend that you talk to your family members about what you want to happen. And again, it doesn't really matter how old you are, what stage of your career that you're in. It's really important that your spouse, parent, child, whoever is the closest to you understands what your wishes are. You can also, of course, talk to legal and financial advisors. You want to choose an executor and make sure they understand what your intention is. If you are thinking about bequeathing your art and papers to a university or a library or even something else, a historical society, for example, any cultural heritage institution, you definitely want to talk to them first about your plan because you want to be sure that they can accept the materials. Accepting any donations is a commitment and it requires resources on the part of the institution. So we can't always accept things that we might want to accept. Some things might be outside of the scope of our collections. They might not meet what our collection's priorities are at that time. I encourage people, don't take any offense at that or be discouraged by that if you're interested in donating, but the institution is unable to make that kind of commitment. But it's good to know that before you get your will or your trust or your financial plan set in place. The important thing, though, is once you make a decision is to document that, to actually have a will or an estate plan. Telling your loved ones what you want to have happen is great, but that doesn't necessarily mean it will happen in the end. And we have a lot of examples at Billy Ireland where someone's intentions, for whatever reason, weren't followed through on. So while you're thinking about that, you want to also think about your intellectual property. So I would definitely include your intellectual property in your will or your trust. Think about who you want to control your copyright to the work when you're gone. This is really, really important, and you should, definitely think a lot about that. If you leave your artwork or your papers to a university, you can also give them the intellectual property so that they control the copyright if you choose, or you can just give them the physical materials and you can give someone else the control over the copyright or the intellectual property. So you can split that up. If, for example, you want your child or your spouse to control the copyright, but you want the physical materials preserved in a library. And last, don't forget about your digital assets when you're making your plans. You can make a digital will, and this is basically just a record of your digital assets, where they are, how to access them. So if you think about it, if something were to happen to you, would someone be able to find all these and access them and make sure they're preserved? If you think about all the different places where now we're storing our digital work, where we're publishing our digital work, you want to think about that long term and how you can be sure that those are preserved, accessible, and archived. So there's our website and my email, and that's some of the main points that I wanted to make, but I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that anybody has about the library or about anything that I've been talking about today. And I will stop sharing.
Cool. Thank you so much, Jenny. That was really great. So yeah, we can open it up to questions now. If you have any questions, you can ask them in two different ways. One is you could click on the raise your hand button in the participants section of your Zoom screen. And the other option is you can type your question into the chat and I will ask the question on your behalf. We have a question already asking, do I need to move away from Florida, which is very warm and very humid, and the temperatures do fluctuate quite a bit.
Yes, and someday might be underwater. We don't even know, right?
Right. Yes, that is very true.
Yeah, so certainly there are lots of places in Florida where it's very safe to store your materials. So I don't necessarily think you have to move, but you do want to, as I said, try to monitor where you're storing everything. You want to check and see, if the humidity is high. If you don't have a choice, just visually inspect it as often as you can and just make sure there aren't any problems developing. Catch them early, is what I would say.
Cool.
And I understand nobody in Florida has basements, right? So at least we don't
correct.
have to worry about people storing things in basements.
So I had a question about just kind of like, what is it that the Billy Ireland collection looks for? You mentioned that you can't take everything, and so just kind of like when you are thinking about the special collection that exists there, both the library and the art collection and the archives, what are you looking for, and how do you determine what goes into your collection?
So we have a collection development policy, and the one that's currently online, we're in the process of revising, and we're hoping to get that process done soon. We would like to have representative examples of every working professional cartoonist's work. That is a goal of ours. So even if we can't take everyone's entire collection and their papers, we would absolutely like to see your work represented in our collection, whether that's through printed books, original art. We absolutely want to have as broad a collection as possible. I will say that we focus mostly on printed or still cartoons and comics. So we are not actively collecting in the area of animation. While we do have some animation, and certainly there's a lot of crossover between people who are animators and people who do comics and graphic novels and other things, our focus really is not on animation. It's on print and still comics. We are one of our biggest priorities right now is trying to diversify our collection, like a lot of cultural heritage institutions. We would like to see a wider variety of voices and creators represented. So that's one of our priorities right now. And I should say that we have a small acquisitions budget, so we do purchase when we can. One of the things to think about if you're a creator and you're self-publishing or you're publishing through, say, Kickstarter, it's really hard for libraries to find your work and to include your work in their collections, if that's the case. So you might want to be a little proactive in letting us know about it, because our purchasing structures aren't set up to do Kickstarters or to to find these works that are being self-published or coming from smaller presses. So that's one thing I would definitely recommend, is to be really proactive, because a lot of times we'd love to find work to purchase, we just aren't able to. We are running a pilot program right now where we're supporting some Kickstarters, because we recognize that that's in a lot of cases how books are getting published. And so that might be one of the only opportunities for us to get that physical book, that oftentimes is maybe reprinting things that were published online. Maybe it's not, maybe it's something brand new. So we've been doing a pilot project within our libraries where we're able to actually support Kickstarter projects.
We have a question in the chat, but just to follow up on that, I know that with like some awards, like the Ignatz Awards, or like when Best American Comics was happening, there was sort of a philosophy with a lot of folks, at least who are self-publishing, this idea that you always send a copy to Best American Comics, always send 6 copies to the Ignatz Awards, no matter how small you think your chances are of like being recognized by those institutions. Is that something that you would be interested in people doing, of like having the Billy Ireland collection being like on the list of places to send a copy, like instead of like reaching out and being like, hey, this is for sale? Do you accept that sort of thing? Or
yes, I would say it's always better to ask, can I send you this? For example, during the pandemic, we couldn't accept materials, so we didn't want people just mailing things. but in general, and Christy, I hope you don't kill me, but if you mail us something, we're delighted, and assuming that it fits in the scope of our collection, we will be glad to include it in the collection. I should also say that, of course, as self-publishers, you all know that you want to register your works with the Library of Congress. I know that you can do that online. You can even register things that are published online. I believe there's a fee involved. I'm not an expert on that. I've never done it myself, but that is something that I highly recommend as well, in terms of thinking about your long-term legacy.
Well, the question in the chat is from Ben asking, are you aware of any special considerations for storing and or framing original art on craft tint board and art with zip/screen tone?
Yes, craft tint and zip/screen tone. So those have inherent vices, the characteristics that they do discolor over time, regardless how they're stored. I think the best thing that you can do, if you're framing them and displaying them, absolutely keep them away from UV light to the extent that you can. I like to hang my art in my guest bathroom that doesn't have a shower and has no windows. Also on the landing of our stairs where there's no daylight. But that will hasten the discoloration process. So I definitely recommend, if you can store it away in the dark, that's best. I also recommend, in some cases, if you make a beautiful reproduction of the work and frame that and display it, and you can enjoy it that way, but keep the original in the dark and store it appropriately. If that's possible, that can be a good compromise as well. A lot of times people can't even tell that they're not looking at the original. You'll know, but other people, your house guests might not. Did that answer your question, Ben?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for the question, Ben. So you talked a little bit about like papers, dating your artwork, that sort of thing. If artists are like selling their original art, their original like pages from their comics, which is a way a lot of cartoonists make an income, is there any sort of like documentation that you would want for that would be helpful? If like suddenly there, somebody's graphic novel, the original pages for that are an incomplete collection, having any sort of like information about where the missing pages went or anything like that?
I think that's a great idea. If you can keep track of which pages you've sold or given away, and keep either scan it, you probably would have a scan of it if it's been printed. I think that's a great idea, Neil. Obviously, things move from person to person, so there's no guarantee that that person still owns that original, but it's at least something to go on if ultimately somebody wants to track down that page.
Cool. I did want to ask you a few questions about the Billy Ireland Library and Museum from the perspective of maybe people who aren't making comics. But so I think something that I don't know if we mentioned this yet, but the Billy Ireland Library and Museum is a public. It's like part of a public university. Correct me if I'm wrong, but anyone can make an appointment. I mean, in non-pandemic times, can make an appointment to come into the reading room and view original artwork and papers and that sort of thing, right?
Absolutely. So Ohio State is what's called a land grant university, and basically that just means that it was created under a special land grant law that has its own troublesome history, but nevertheless, the idea being that the university would serve not only its students and faculty, but also all the citizens of the state and beyond. So we have a real outreach mission, and all of everything that we do is open to the public. So if you're interested in seeing any of our collection, you can come to our reading room. We call it a reading room. It's just a room with tables. And you can request anything, even if it's a Coward and Hobbes original. We will bring it out and you can look at it. We will probably make you wear white gloves if it's artwork, but you can access any of our materials. As you said, right now we're only open by appointment and very limited hours in an effort to keep everybody as safe as possible. And other restrictions, you have to wear a mask, et cetera, et cetera. Our museum is open and is also currently by appointment. Normally it's not by appointment. You can just walk in any of our open hours. And that is free and open to anybody. So come to Columbus if you haven't, and come and visit us.
So I've been lucky enough to visit the library a few times when I've come for Cartoon Crossroads Columbus, which is a
Mhm.
fantastic comics festival that happens at the end of September.
Yeah, end of September, beginning of October, right around there.
And you know, I feel like every year you do a behind the scenes tour that you can sign up for, and I've gone on every single time I've gone on the tour, and there was at least one time when I was on the I was thinking about going on the tour, and I was like, well, I've been a couple times, like what is there to see? And I signed up anyway, and I was going through the tour, and the person who was leading the tour held up an original Charles Schulz Peanuts comic strip, and it like literally brought me to tears. Like I was welling up just seeing this beautiful Peanuts comic strip, and I was hoping maybe you could talk a little bit about like what the benefit is of seeing original art in person versus seeing it reproduced in a book, because it could definitely like seem like a comic strip that's drawn just like black ink line on paper is pretty indistinguishable when you're reproducing it in a book, versus the original on paper. Yeah, I was hoping maybe you could talk about
I
that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because there is something different about seeing the original, um, and it can be a very emotional experience. Part of it is because you're really seeing the hand of the artist. Part of it is because you can sometimes see details that don't that you don't notice or you can't distinguish depending on how it was printed. Um, it's interesting because some of the art we have, it's pretty clear that the artist never intended for it to be seen by people, or to be hung in a museum. There's corrections, there's whiteout, there's blue pencil in a lot of cases. Um, but even that gives you special details and tells you something about the artwork and about the process, that you might not see from the printed version. So I think, for us, it's a combination of the emotional reaction that you get from being with that original, but also what you can learn from looking at it that you might not be able to see from the printed version.
Cool, thanks. Are there any other questions in the chat, or if you wish to ask it verbally, you can raise your hand. I'm gonna do a last call for
Hi, Rebecca.
questions.
Rebecca is on this call. She's from the Cartoon Crossroads Columbus.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Jenny, for your presentation and for answering our questions. I am pasting the link to the Billy Ireland Library and Museum into the chat, as well as a link to Radiator Comics Studio. We do have more programs coming up, which I was hoping I could mention in our closing statements here. And I'm actually going to share my screen for this.
Well, I'll just say thank you so much for hosting this, Neil, and it was a real pleasure.
Thanks. Yeah, it was. I'm really happy that I was able to have you here to talk about this. So yeah, thank you again. I did want to mention some of the events that are coming up for Radiator Comics Studio. A week from today, February 16th at 8 p.m. Eastern, we're hosting a release event for the first issue of Spiny Orb Weaver, which is a publication that's part of Radiator Comics Studio. It features comics and interviews from South Florida. So next week, cartoonists Miss Jaws and Tana Oshima will be joining us to present their comics from this issue. And then this month, we're also starting a new demonstration series called Hands On, which is kind of like a comics cooking show in which practicing cartoonists will demonstrate their techniques on different aspects of comics making. I'm starting things off this Saturday, February 13th at 3 p.m. Eastern, when I'll demonstrate how I take my finished art and turn it into a publication using a photocopier and household items. There's no scanning, but there is some math, just as a warning. And then continuing in this series is on Saturday, February 27th, also at 3 p.m. Acclaimed cartoonist Summer Pierre will demonstrate her daily diary comics drawing practice and talk about the benefits of self-reflection and daily drawing. And then on Sunday, February 21st, I'm jumping around chronologically a little bit, at 5 p.m. Eastern, we're hosting our semi-monthly social event for cartoonists called Cartoonist Coffee. Cartoonists of any experience level are welcome to join in to have casual small group conversations with other comics makers from around the country on Zoom. And then every Friday from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we host Open Studio, when we open up our Zoom for you to make time to work on your comics in the presence of others. And you'll meet other cartoonists and you'll get stuff done. It's great. It's a lot of fun. For all of these events, all experience levels are welcome and they're all free. Lastly, we do still have copies of Sun and Sand Comic Anthology, which we co-published with Black Jose Press. It features 10 wonderful comics from South Florida by local cartoonists. It's printed beautifully by KSY Press. And if you go to sunsandcomics.wordpress.com, you can read them for free online, or you can download a digital PDF. You can also request a physical copy, and if you cover the postage, we'll mail you a copy. So one thing that I actually did not ask that I meant to, because you brought up Cardamonier and Diskette Press, was how you feel about risograph printing, which is very much not archival.
How I feel about it.
As a representative of an institution that cares a lot about the preservation of objects.
Yes, absolutely. We will preserve it even if it's not an ideal circumstance. So we have a lot of really early zines and mini comics. We have one by Art Spiegelman that he explained was made by a hectograph, which is really just a tray of gelatin that you put ink on, and you can make a small number of copies. So yeah, these are things again that we have to be really careful with, because there's inherent vice in them. But the best thing to do is to store those in the best conditions possible. So, and if you're making your mini comic with household items, again, please don't use rubber cement. But if you have to, we'll still take it. We'll do the best we can. And I just want to say, while you were talking about events, mark your calendars. Cartoon Crossroads Columbus, Rebecca has taught us in the chat, September 30th to October 3rd in 2021. And it will be certainly virtual, might have in-person components depending on how things go.
And the Billy Ireland and CXC are doing an event February, I'm going to check my calendar real quick, with MS Harkness, right?
Yep.
Which I just signed up for.
Oh, great.
Today. I think it's the 20 out. I don't want to say it incorrectly.
Yes, I don't remember the exact day either.
It is the 25th at 6 p.m. Eastern. So, and that's going to be a great event as well. MS makes some really great comics. So thank you again, Jenny. And thanks everybody for joining in tonight. I hope everybody has a safe week, and We'll see you soon.
Great.
Thanks,
Bye-bye, everybody.
everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.